Thank you, Mr President. I indicate that the Summary Offences Prostitution Law Reform Amendment Bill is a conscience vote for the Liberal Party, as is standard practice for such matters in our party. Like many of my colleagues, I have received a large amount of correspondence from individuals and groups sharing their views on how they believe prostitution would most appropriately be dealt with. I thank members of the community for their time in sharing their views. For many in this place, their position on prostitution or sex work is already recorded for the public record. Being a relatively new Member of Parliament, my position on prostitution is not yet in the public domain. I seek members' indulgence as I briefly address my position on the decriminalisation of prostitution in my speech. I hope in doing so I can provide clarity on my views on this matter. I acknowledge the hard work of the Honourable Nicola Centofanti MLC in introducing this bill to the Parliament, an issue she is very clearly passionate about. In the contributions members have made, it has been clear that at the heart of their decision on which model of prostitution they support and whether to support this bill or not, the safety of women has been at the forefront of that decision. Ultimately, we differ on how that is best achieved. Throughout my contribution, I will refer to the impact upon women, as those who are prostituted are more often women. I acknowledge that this is not solely applicable to women. Given the existing legislation and the proposed bill uses the term prostitution, I will too, but I made no disrespect in doing so. Throughout my contribution in relation to this bill, I would like to make it clear that when I'm speaking about prostitution, I'm referring to consensual prostitution in which the individual is a willing participant. It is my view that where there is abuse, assault, rape or sex trafficking, these are separate yet sometimes interrelated issues, but not the act of prostitution and therefore not what is being legislated for here today. My contribution is in no way intended to say that these other offences do not occur or are not issues. They absolutely are, but it is important to remember what we are legislating for here today. I note that there are existing federal laws that account for trafficking and, of course, state laws which account for abuse, assault and rape. I would say that if these laws are not adequate, then the federal and state parliaments should address these issues, but that is not what we are debating here in this bill. In my preparation for this debate, I have read Hansard and the reflections of some of the previous decriminalisation debates. I wish to share with this chamber an excerpt from the Attorney-General's favourite former Member of Parliament, the Honourable Rob Lucas MLC, when he said, and I will quote, "Can I say at the outset that I absolutely support the right of members we have had in the past, and if there are members here in this chamber today whose judgments they bring to bear on this particular legislation or others that are governed almost completely by their personal moral code or their belief system, I defend to the end their right to interpret their role in this chamber as a legislator in that particular way." He says there is no right way and there is no wrong way. Mr President, it is largely my values that underpin my view on this debate. In considering the proposed legislation, I believe it important to reflect on the existing framework. Prostitution in South Australia is currently partially criminalised. Brothels are illegal. Keeping, managing and receiving money paid in a brothel in respect of prostitution or permitting a premises to be used as a brothel is prohibited. Authorised police officers may at any time enter and search premises which are suspected on reasonable grounds to be a brothel. Street prostitution is illegal. Escort agencies are not mentioned in legislation, and there is nothing in the Act specifically about private operators. Pursuant to the Summary Offences Act, other relevant offences include permitting premises to be frequented by prostitutes, being on premises frequented by prostitutes without reasonable excuse, soliciting or accosting a person in a public place or within the view or hearing of any person in a public place, loitering in a public place for the purpose of prostitution, engaging in procurement for prostitution, knowingly living wholly or in part on the earnings of prostitution of another person. The Criminal Law Consolidation Act creates offences relating to commercial sexual services, sexual servitude and the use of children in commercial sexual services. Pursuant to this Act, the common law offence of keeping a common bawdy house is punishable by imprisonment of no more than 2 years. In consideration of this bill, my office has conducted a series of Freedom of Information requests to determine how the existing framework has been applied. These FOIs found nil arrests and fines for keeping or managing a brothel during the date range of the 25th of the 9th, 2022 to the 26th of the 9th, 2023. There were, however, 5 reports for the offence of keep brothel within this date range. No fines issued for soliciting for the purpose of prostitution during the date range of the 25th of the 9th, 2022 to 26th of the 9th, 2023. No arrests or fines issued for living off the earnings of prostitution of another person, including for escort services during the date range of the 25th of the 9th, 2022 to 26th of the 9th, 2023, and no arrests or fines issued for procurement for prostitution during the date range of the 25th of the 9th, 2022 to the 26th of the 9th, 2023. I've had people raise with me that the status quo is not working. I've heard this from those who support the Nordic model and those who support the full decriminalisation model. I appreciate that the decriminalisation of prostitution is something that has been debated many times in this place. As I have not put my position on the record, I will address the full decriminalisation of prostitution, as I have had multiple groups and individuals approach me in support of a full decriminalisation model. I believe it is important to pin my colours to the mast and stay true to my convictions. I do not see my position changing regarding the decriminalisation model should further bills be brought on this issue. I do not support decriminalising prostitution. I do not believe that prostitution should be a viable career prospect. I believe that individuals should be deterred from entering prostitution. I equally believe that individuals should be deterred from purchasing sexual services and from exploiting women. I do not believe that decriminalising prostitution is in the interest of society as a whole or for the women who are involved in prostitution. To decriminalise prostitution would essentially serve to be cultural approval and normalise such behaviour. Sex should not be an expectation. No woman should be able to sell sex or to have their bodies bought for sex. I disagree with the objectification of women that prostitution allows for. The value of women should not be based on their physical appearance and sexual appeal, which is something that underpins prostitution. It is my belief that the right to access women for sex, for money, reduces prostituted women to a commodity. As I see it, even if prostitution was decriminalised and heavily regulated and normalised, that there would always be an imbalance of power. It comes from the very nature of a client procuring a service that is that personal in nature. It comes from the reality that often female prostitutes will likely be smaller than their clients and operate in an isolated and secluded environment. This inherently leaves them vulnerable. No workplace should ever place its workers in such vulnerable positions. Economic independence should not come with the risk of harm or abuse. I appreciate that those who support the full decriminalisation model will likely say that to decriminalise prostitution would address safety concerns. I respectfully disagree and think that the inherent nature of prostitution will always leave prostitutes vulnerable and subject to power imbalance. This is an unacceptable risk, in my opinion. The best way to protect women is not to decriminalise or regulate the industry, but to reduce it and criminalise it. It is one of the oldest professions, so I'm not naive to think that it will cease to exist. Though it is with the acknowledgement of this reality that I have attempted to balance in my approach the need to reduce women entering the industry, to stop men from purchasing sex and exploiting women, to provide avenues for support for those who are vulnerable within prostitution, and exit strategies for them if they look for them, with the reality that there will inevitably still be women who remain within the sex industry. It is important that those who seek to exit the industry have the support that they need to be able to do so. Just because this is one of the oldest professions in the world does not mean that it cannot or should not be changed. Ultimately, it is my aim that there is a reduction in those who enter prostitution to begin with, and that those who are within prostitution have exit strategies to leave prostitution should they choose. Mr. President, in my belief, the Nordic model does not go far enough. In all honesty, I support full criminalisation of prostitution with what I would call safe harbour provisions. In my conversations with people on either side of the debate and in my consideration of this difficult issue, I must say I fully appreciate there are concerns the criminalisation of prostitution leaves people, often women, vulnerable to physical and sexual violence, which can mean that prostitutes are reluctant to report assaults for fear of themselves being charged with prostitution-related offences. I have often wondered whether the establishment of safe harbour provisions would be beneficial within a full criminalised model. A model where both the sale and purchase of sex would be criminalised, but where there is a carve-out, if you will, where the prostitute cannot be charged with prostitution-related offences if they fell within set exemptions, where they could declare that they have been operating as a prostitute when reporting offences to the police, for example, if they've been raped or stolen from, in seeking housing and welfare assistance, healthcare, etc., without the fear of prosecution. The intention being that women would be able to declare that they've been operating as a prostitute in seeking this assistance without fear of prosecution from the authorities. Importantly, it would assist those who are already within the industry in seeking help and getting out if they choose. For obvious reasons, these women are currently not able to do this, and I think it is important for them to be able to do so. I do not necessarily agree with criminalising only one party, whether it be the sale, as it currently is, or the purchase. It is my view that where one side of the equation is criminalised, the other party knows that they are causing, assisting and or facilitating an offence by the other person. Both parties should be responsible for their actions and both parties should equally be deterred. I find it peculiar that you would be able to deliver a service you know is illegal for someone else to purchase. In a sense, it's like punishing a drug buyer while the dealer gets off free. So all considered, my preferred outcome for this issue would be a model where you could criminalise the sale and purchase of prostitution-related offences, but have a legislative framework where those who are seeking police support, health services, HIV treatment and prevention, sexual health services or housing support cannot be charged with prostitution-related offences when seeking those supports. I appreciate that at this time the support would likely not exist in this chamber to enable such a model of criminalisation to pass. With that pragmatic acknowledgement that this place is built on its numbers, I now turn to the Summary Offences Prostitution Law Reform Amendment Bill, which is a bill based on the Nordic model. The Nordic model seeks to decriminalise those who are prostituted and seeks to criminalise the purchaser. It looks to provide support services to help prostitutes exit the sex industry while trying to work to reduce the demand that drives prostitution. For this reason, I can see the benefits of the Nordic model that would allow a prostitute to seek that help to be able to exit the industry and to be able to seek the assistance needed. Mr. President, in considering this bill, I reflected on a quote I've shared in this place a couple of times now. It reads, "Before we voice a preference on public policy, whether in the voting booth or talking with family members over dinner, we should consider one question with two parts. First, what are the costs of choosing the wrong policy? And second, who would have to bear those potential costs? If the wrong solution is chosen, a problem will likely persist as before or even be made worse." From speaking with those who have previously worked as prostitutes and those who work closely with prostitutes, the existing framework deters prostitutes from being able to seek the help that they need, and some would say is not working. I acknowledge there is a stigma associated with working in prostitution that can make it difficult for those who may be looking to exit the industry. For this reason, I can see the benefit for change from status quo. A change that would see the better support and protection for those working as prostitutes who seek to leave the industry. I can see that the Nordic model presents the opportunity to create that support. The intention behind the Nordic model is a noble one. It is to protect those who work in the sex industry, to give them the support they need to be able to exit prostitution. It also holds the purchasers who exploit prostitutes to account through criminalising the purchase. The intention of this is something I support. In considering whether to support this bill, I thought about what my aim is within a legislative framework for prostitution. I'll try and briefly summarise my top 3 key objectives. The first is deterring women from entering into prostitution. It is my belief that the best way we can support women is to stop them from being in such vulnerable positions to begin with. This is something that I believe the existing framework, or status quo, better achieves than the proposed Nordic model, as it provides a deterrent for those considering prostitution, as they'd be breaking the law. The second is to stop the purchase of sex and to hold those who are exploiting women to account. This is something the proposed legislation addresses, where the existing framework is, in my view, lacking. And the third is to provide support to women in prostitution and to those who are seeking to exit the industry. This is something the proposed legislation addresses, where the existing framework is lacking. It would be remiss of me to not highlight where my views differ to those of the Nordic model. I'll place on my record the reflections of the Nordic model, but to be clear, these are my reflections on the Nordic model more generally and not reflections on the work of the Honourable Nicholas Centofanti. The Swedish government, which has implemented the Nordic model in its jurisdiction, has been explicit in its understanding of prostitution and why it chooses to implement the criminalisation of the consumer model. In a Swedish government fact sheet, it provided that the Swedish government and Parliament have, through the implementation of the legislation pertaining to the protection of women, defined prostitution as men's violence against women. The official Swedish view is that no prostitution can be said to be voluntary. It should be noted that the rationale behind the Nordic model has not been universally supported. As Carhon Chu and Glass state, within this framework, all men who purchase are deemed to be aggressors, and all women in sex work are deemed to be victims of male violence and patriarchal oppression, a framing that conflates sex work within trafficking, pathologises male clients, and renders male and trans workers largely invisible. I disagree with the notion that prostitutes are automatically oppressed victims because of the title of their job, and that all purchasers are aggressors. I agree that purchasers are exploiting women, and that those who work as prostitutes are vulnerable. I refute the notion that no prostitution can be voluntary. I am not naive to think that there are not some in our community who want to work as prostitutes. In fact, I have met with and spoken with some. I'm not naive to think that there are not some who enter prostitution, whether it be for a romanticised notion of what prostitution could be or through desperation and vulnerability. The idea that no prostitute ever can voluntarily enter prostitution, I think, poses a few key issues. I do query with that logic, if no prostitute can ever voluntarily enter prostitution, does that then not mean that prostitutes are there against their will and as such do not consent to sexual relations? Meaning, in theory, we're talking about rape, not prostitution. I do not agree with this as a broad characterisation of prostitution, and I'm most certainly not asserting that this is what the Honourable Member is proposing. I merely highlight the importance of language in this space. I do not believe the act of prostitution is, in and of itself, an act of violence against women, although violence can be interlinked, and sadly, from experiences I have heard in the lead up to this debate, something which is all too common. I have heard the phrase paid rape used in my preparation for this contribution. I think it is important to differentiate between prostitution and abuse, rape, or assault. It is my view that where there are two consenting adults, where boundaries are respected, the latter is not a consideration. However, in instances where a purchaser has exceeded the established boundaries by the prostitute, then that is abuse, rape, or assault. I would like to think that there would be few in our community who would think that the act of accepting a client gives the purchaser a free pass to do whatever they like, especially when the prostitute says stop or no. I believe there is a power imbalance between the purchaser and the prostitute and the underworld nature of the industry, which may make it challenging in practice to refuse a request of a client. I do, however, think that language matters and that in the consideration of this bill is important to reinforce that no means no, even if you pay for it. To be incredibly clear, rape, assault and other crimes absolutely would and do occur within prostitution. I'm not denying these life-changing and unforgivable, disgusting acts occur. It is without doubt heinous, and any individual who rapes someone should have the book thrown at them and be punished to the greatest extent possible. I raise this, however, merely to highlight that the legislation we are dealing with here today is that of prostitution, not of rape. At the point at which any of the before-mentioned offences occur, it is a different offence that would ultimately apply. At the point at which we are speaking about rape, we are no longer referring to consensual sex, paid or otherwise. Language is so important in this space. No matter what the surrounding circumstances, no means no. Whatever the woman is wearing, no means no. Even if you've paid for it, no means no. It is never the fault of the victim, and I really want to reiterate that here today. To any current or former sex workers who have been raped or assaulted in doing what you do, for whatever reason you do it, no one should ever have to endure that. I thank the former sex workers who were incredibly brave in sharing their stories with me in consideration of this bill. So many who have shared their stories, who are incredibly strong and brave, to discuss what is no doubt an awful experience in the pursuit of advocacy for those who perhaps are not in a position to advocate for themselves. Whatever the outcome of today's bill, no matter which side of the debate you might sit, please take pride in your efforts to advocate for the safety of women. As I highlighted earlier in my contribution, I believe all members approach this subject with the safety of women at the forefront of their intentions. It is ultimately how we believe this is best achieved that differs. As I've said from the outset, I absolutely think that those who are prostituted are exploited by the purchaser, who are most commonly men. I think it is important to differentiate between prostitution and sex trafficking, and that these issues are not conflated, although they are obviously interlinked. United Against Human Trafficking outlines that whilst prostitutes might be exploited, they would be considered to enter the sex industry as a willing participant. Whether through direct or indirect exploitation, they use prostitution as a means for income. That is different to someone who is a victim of human trafficking, who is forced into the sex industry against their will by some measure of force, fraud, or coercion. Whilst both of these instances will have women and men who need support in exiting prostitution, their situations are not always the same. United Against Human Trafficking outlines the elements of sex trafficking and the elements of prostitution. The elements of trafficking, the act is recruitment, transportation, transfer, harbouring or receipt of persons. The means is threat or use of force, coercion, abduction, fraud, deception, abuse of power or vulnerability, or giving payments or benefits to a person in control of the victim. And the purpose is prostitution of others, sexual exploitation, forced labour or services, or slavery. The elements of prostitution, the act is sexual act or contact with another person in return for giving or receiving a fee or a thing of value, and means is to invite, entice, offer, persuade or agree to engage in prostitution. As previously highlighted, my ideal model in respect of the issue would have three key objectives. The first, to criminalise the sale of sex as a deterrent to entering prostitution. The second, to criminalise the purchase of sex to hold men accountable for exploiting women, which reduces demand. And the third being exit strategies for women to get out of prostitution, coupled with safe harbour provisions. To address the first objective, criminalising the sale, I do note, Mr. President, that I think the existing framework is unfair. It prosecutes the woman for selling sex. Meanwhile, the man who is exploiting women, who may often find themselves in this position due to desperation or vulnerable circumstances, is not criminalised. It is my belief that both the sale and the purchase should be criminalised. If perhaps I could give the example of selling drugs. I think it would be seen as quite unusual in the community if the person selling hard drugs was not criminalised, but just the purchaser alone was. Both parties know that what they are doing is wrong, and both are held accountable for their actions. I note that this is consistent with the general approach that is taken when people are involved in criminal activity, even when there may be drug addiction, economic disadvantage, or other circumstances involved. If I could use another example, Mr. President, just because someone is on drugs does not mean that they are not charged with theft when they steal. Mr. President, even when only one side of the transaction is criminalised, the other willing participant who is not criminalised is aware that they are aiding, abetting and or procuring the offence. I have heard in preparation for this bill that prostitution is not a choice, that no one chooses prostitution, that when it comes down to paying your bills or prostitution, there is no choice. I respectfully disagree. As a Liberal, one of the key values in our party is the belief in personal responsibility. At some point, Personal responsibility must be taken into consideration. To say that prostitutes do not enter the industry voluntarily removes that personal responsibility for one's actions and the deterrence that goes with it. Whatever the reason, a decision was ultimately made to go down this path, even if through desperation. Even though vulnerability is involved, this does not necessarily mean that these women are unable to make a decision or that there is no choice. I appreciate that I may differ in my view to some of my colleagues on this. I once again reiterate that I'm referring to prostitution, meaning consenting adults, and not to rape, assault, sex trafficking, or other offences. Offences which, of course, take away that personal agency. We must also remember that there are some who do genuinely want to work in the industry. No, Mr. President, I'm not thinking of the movie Pretty Woman, I am being realistic. I have met with current and former prostitutes who have told me this. I do not have rose-coloured glasses, I do not think it's a job like any other, I don't think it should be a viable career option, nor that it would be a pleasant existence. If we are to look at how to address the issue at hand, we must be realistic that there are some in our community who, no matter what barriers are placed, will still remain to be prostitutes. This place exists for the purpose of determining what it, the Parliament, believes is in the best interests of society as a whole. There are probably a number of people who want to sell hard drugs for a living, but that does not mean that we should enable this. Preventing entry is at least as important as efforts to help women to exit after they have been harmed. I'm concerned that by decriminalising the sale of sex, that we are removing a deterrent, that we are removing an obstacle from people entering prostitution to begin with, particularly in a tech-heavy world where OnlyFans exists, where the proliferation and payment for sexually explicit material is available at the click of a button and with the tap of a credit card. Ultimately, Mr. President, in weighing up the existing model that criminalises the sale with the bill which does not, I thought it more important that men be accountable for exploiting women and more important that women have the support to exit the industry. Whilst this bill does not criminalise a sale, I believe it is moving in a positive direction by criminalising the purchase of sex, by holding those who seek to exploit women to account. It is by no means a perfect outcome, and I've laboured over whether to support this bill. It has not been a linear process or a clear outcome from the outset for me. I have tried to grapple with whether decriminalising the sale of sexual services, which is something that I disagree with, is something that sits with my conscience. I'm someone who probably could be described as stubborn and firm in my views. In this, Mr. President, I am clear on my beliefs. I have arrived at the decision to support this bill in this instance, but state clearly that it is still my view that it does not go far enough, and I have sought to clearly put on the record my reservations. I disagree with the language of some of the logic used in the Nordic model, but in putting that to one side and looking at the bill before us, Mr. President, this model addresses 2 out of the 3 aims I wish to see in any legislative framework around prostitution. Ultimately, Mr. President, when the only options on the table are to either punish the vulnerable woman who is being exploited or to punish the purchaser or abuser who is exploiting vulnerable women, I'll take the second option every day of the week. Where there is currently no option on the table to criminalise both parties, I believe the people who should bear the potential costs of who would bear the potential costs of a remaining status quo are those who are vulnerable and will be impaired in their exit from the industry or in seeking intervention when offences are committed against them. I think it's more important in weighing up the 2 models that we see women exit the industry and receive the support that they desire. I've given much consideration about whether to support this bill in circumstances where the Nordic model is not my ideal model. However, I indicate that I will be supporting this bill today. As I conclude my remarks, Mr. President, I acknowledge the immense work that has been put into this bill by the Honourable Nicola Centofanti and her office. Her dedication and passion to this worthy cause should be commended. I acknowledge her courage in bringing this bill, a model that is different to what is often brought to this place. When members bring these bills, conscience matters, they know that it will not be an easy path with legislation that is closely scrutinised. I have no doubt that the Honourable Nicholas Centofanti will continue her advocacy in giving a voice to those who may not be in a position to speak for themselves. With that, Mr President, I indicate my support for this legislation and commend the bill to the Chamber.